Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine your parents asking you to move out of the house you've been renting from them, but still expecting you to keep paying the rent because your golden child sibling needs a place to stay. Now imagine flipping the entire situation on its head and walking away not just with your dignity intact, but with the house itself. It started as a regular family dinner, the kind we'd been having since I moved into the rental house my parents owned. The food was fine, the conversation predictable, but I couldn't help noticing my parents exchanging glances throughout the meal. My mom would give my dad a little nudge, and he'd nod back like they were silently rehearsing a script. Something was up. When the plates were cleared, my mom folded her hands on the table and gave me the "we need to talk" look. My dad adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat like he was preparing to deliver bad news. So, my mom began, her tone carefully measured. "We've been thinking about Jake." Of course, it was about Jake. My younger brother had been the center of their world for as long as I could remember. He was the golden child, the one who always got a pass no matter what he did. I braced myself for whatever favor they were about to ask on his behalf. "You know how hard things have been for him since his breakup," she continued, glancing at my dad for confirmation. I nodded, though I was sick of hearing about it. Jake's girlfriend of 3 years had dumped him 2 months ago, and according to my parents, his life had completely fallen apart. I'd already endured countless updates about how he was struggling to pay his rent now that he was living alone in their shared apartment. "Okay," I asked, my tone deliberately neutral. "Well," my dad said, leaning forward, "we were wondering if you'd consider moving out of the house so Jake could move in here with us." I blinked, waiting for him to finish the sentence with something that made sense. "You want me to move out so Jake can move in?" I repeated slowly, trying to process the sheer audacity of the request. "Yes," my mom said quickly, as if that made it reasonable. "And since you're doing so well financially, we thought you could keep paying the rent while you look for a new place." I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. "Let me get this straight," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You want me to leave the house I've been renting from you for years, keep paying rent, and let Jake move in for free?" My mom's face fell into her classic look of martyrdom. "It's not like that," she said, her voice heavy with faux disappointment. "We just thought, since you're so responsible, you'd understand. Jake is going through a hard time, and he needs his family right now." I could feel my anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. "And what about what I need?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. "I've been paying rent on time every month. I've taken care of the house. This is my home. Why should I give that up for Jake?" "You're not giving it up," my dad said, as if this was some kind of compromise. "We're just asking you to help out until Jake gets back on his feet. You can stay here a little longer while you look for another place." I laughed bitterly. "So, I get to pay for a house I'm not living in while Jake gets a free ride? That's what you're asking me to do?" My mom sighed, her eyes filling with the kind of tears she used to win every argument. "It's not just about Jake," she said softly. "It's about family. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the people we love." That word, sacrifices, hit me like a slap in the face. Growing up, I'd made more sacrifices for Jake than I could count. When he didn't want to share a room, I moved to the smaller one. When he broke the car I'd saved up for, my parents helped him replace it while I was stuck taking the bus. And now, they wanted me to give up my home for him too? "I'm sorry," I said, standing up from the table. "But I'm not doing this. If Jake needs help, that's on you. Don't expect me to pay the price for his mistakes." As I walked out the door, I could hear my mom calling after me, her voice trembling with disappointment. "We're just trying to help him. Why can't you understand that?" But I did understand. I understood perfectly. This wasn't about family. It was about Jake. It always had been. And for the first time, I wasn't going to let them push me aside. I couldn't get their ridiculous request out of my head. I kept replaying the conversation, my parents' faces etched in my memory, my mom with her wide-eyed, incredulous expression, and my dad nodding along as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. It wasn't just their audacity that got to me. It was the entitlement, the expectation that I would upend my life yet again to cater to Jake. "You've been so responsible and independent," my mom had said like it was a compliment. But I knew better. It wasn't praise. It was a setup. Being responsible meant I was the one who could handle the sacrifices. And Jake, the golden child, was apparently too fragile to fend for himself. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't the first time they'd asked me to help Jake. Growing up, it was always me cleaning up after his messes or stepping aside so he could have his way. When he wanted to play football, My parents rearranged our entire schedule around his practices and games. If I had a school event on the same day, well, too bad for me. The worst part was that Jake didn't even seem to realize how much everyone bent over backward for him. He just expected it. Like the time he crashed my car when we were in college. I'd saved for months to buy that car, working every spare hour at a part-time job while balancing my classes. Jake borrowed it one weekend without asking and wrecked it. My parents helped him replace it with a new one, but I was left without a ride, struggling to get to work and school. It wasn't just the big things, either. It was the constant little sacrifices that added up over time. The last slice of pizza? Always Jake's. The TV remote? Jake's choice. Even when he was obviously in the wrong, my parents would find a way to excuse it. He's just a kid, they'd say, long past the point where that was a valid excuse. And now, as adults, nothing had changed. My mom's voice rang in my head. Jake just needs a little help right now. It would mean a lot to us as a family. It wasn't a request. It was a demand, wrapped up in guilt and obligation. The next day, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jake. Hey, Mom said she talked to you about the house. Thanks for being cool about it. Cool about it? I stared at the screen, trying to decide if he was clueless or just manipulative. I typed out a reply, then deleted it. I wasn't going to get into a text war with him. Instead, I called him. Hey, I said when he picked up. Hey, he said, sounding way too cheerful. What's up? I got your message, I said, keeping my tone neutral. But I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not moving out of the house, and I'm definitely not paying rent for you to live there. There was a long pause. Wait, what? He said, his tone shifting to confusion. I told Mom and Dad yesterday, I said, I'm not giving up my home just because you're going through a rough patch. That's not my responsibility. But Mom said you'd be fine with it, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. She said you're doing well financially, and this would just be temporary. I don't care what she said, I replied. It's not happening. Jake sighed loudly, the way he always did when he didn't get his way. You don't understand, he said. I can't afford my place anymore. I'm barely scraping by as it is. What am I supposed to do? I don't know, Jake, I said, my patience wearing thin. Maybe you could downsize. Get a roommate. Budget better. There are options that don't involve kicking me out of my home. That's easy for you to say, he snapped. You've always had it easier. I laughed bitterly. Easier? Are you serious? You're the one who's been handed everything your whole life while I've had to fight for every scrap. Don't pretend like you're the victim here. Jake didn't respond, but I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, whatever. I'll talk to Mom and Dad. And then he hung up. I expected things to blow up after that, and I wasn't wrong. The next time I saw my parents, they were livid. My mom didn't waste any time. Jake told us what you said, she began, her voice shaking. How could you be so selfish? He's your brother. And this is my home, I shot back. I'm not giving it up because Jake can't manage his life. You don't know what he's going through, she said, her eyes welling up with tears. He's struggling. He needs us. And I've been struggling too, I yelled, surprising even myself with the intensity of my voice. I've been struggling my whole life, trying to measure up to your impossible standards while you coddled Jake. And now, when I finally have something that's mine, you want to take it away from me? No, I'm done. My dad tried to step in, his voice calm but firm. We're not trying to take anything away from you, he said. We just thought you'd be more understanding. Understanding? I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Understanding is what I've been my whole life. And where has it gotten me? No. This time, I'm standing up for myself. You can take care of Jake however you want, but leave me out of it. I walked out of their house that day, my heart pounding. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let them push me around anymore. After the blowout over their ridiculous request, I thought my parents might cool down, take a step back, and realize how unreasonable they were being. Instead, they doubled down. It started with my mom, who perfected the art of the guilt trip years ago. She called me the morning after our argument, her voice soft and full of practiced sorrow. I couldn't sleep last night, she began, as though that was supposed to make me feel guilty. I just kept thinking about how divided the family has become. It's not like you to be so harsh. Harsh, I repeated, incredulous. Mom, you're asking me to move out of my own home and keep paying rent for Jake. Do you hear how absurd that sounds? There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line, one of her signature moves. We're not trying to hurt you, she said. We're just trying to keep the family together. You know how hard it's been for Jake. Don't you want to help your brother? The way she said it, you'd think I was the villain in this situation. Of course I want to help, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. But helping doesn't mean giving up my home or throwing money at his problems. There are other ways to support him without completely uprooting my life. But you're doing so well, she countered, her tone almost pleading. You got a good job, you're stable. Jake's struggling. He needs this more than you do. I could feel my patience unraveling. Mom, I've worked hard to get to where I am. Stability didn't just fall into my lap. It took years of effort. And now you're asking me to throw it all away because Jake made poor choices? That's not fair. Her voice wavered, and I knew what was coming next. You know, your dad and I always tried to give you both the best life we could. We made so many sacrifices for you. And now, when we need you to step up, this is how you repay us. There it was, the classic, after all we've done for you line. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. I'm not ungrateful, I said, but this isn't about repaying you. It's about boundaries, and I have every right to set them. My dad got involved a few days later, deciding to take the disappointed but logical approach. He sat me down in the kitchen, his hands clasped on the table like we were in a board meeting. We thought you'd be more understanding, he began, his tone calm but firm. This isn't just about Jake, it's about the family. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for each other. Isn't that what families do? I stared at him, trying to decide if he really believed what he was saying or if he was just playing his part in this guilt-tripping performance. Dad, I said slowly, I've made sacrifices my whole life, for Jake, for you and Mom. And what has that gotten me? The expectation that I'll keep sacrificing, no matter how unfair it is. He sighed, rubbing his temples like I was being difficult. You're being dramatic, he said. No one's asking you to give up everything. This is just a temporary arrangement. Jake needs some time to get back on his feet, and we thought you'd be willing to help. I have helped, I shot back. For years. But this is where I draw the line. I'm not moving out, and I'm not paying rent for a house I'm not living in. The more they talked, the angrier I got. It wasn't just the audacity of their request. It was the expectation that I'd automatically say yes, no matter how unfair it was. They weren't asking me to help. They were demanding it, framing it as a test of my loyalty and love for the family. It reminded me of all the times growing up when I'd been expected to step aside for Jake. When he wanted the bigger bedroom, I was the one who had to move. When he failed a class, my parents spent weeks helping him catch up while my accomplishments were barely acknowledged. And now, as adults, nothing had changed. I'm sorry, I said firmly, standing up from the table. But I'm not doing this. You can guilt me all you want, but it's not going to work. My dad's expression darkened. You know, he said, his voice low, we could always find someone else to rent the house. You're not the only tenant in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was that supposed to be a threat? If that's what you want to do, go ahead, I said, calling his bluff. But good luck finding someone who pays as reliably as I do. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, my dad broke the silence. We'll talk about this later, he said, waving me off like I was a child throwing a tantrum. But I knew there wouldn't be a later. I'd made my position clear, and I wasn't budging. Still, I could tell they weren't giving up. And sure enough, a few days later, they came back with another offer. This time, they tried to frame it as a compromise. If you agree to let Jake move in, my mom said, we'll only ask you to pay half the rent. That's fair, isn't it? I stared at her, dumbfounded. Half the rent for a house I'm not even living in? Are you serious? It's just until Jake gets back on his feet, she insisted. And you can stay here for a few more months while you look for a new place. I couldn't believe the audacity. They weren't backing down, they were doubling down. And if they thought I was going to cave, they were in for a rude awakening. It didn't take long for my parents to circle back with a compromise. They were determined to paint themselves as reasonable, as though the issue here was my lack of understanding rather than their blatant favoritism. When my mom called me over for another chat, I went reluctantly, knowing it would be more of the same. This time, they tried to sweeten the deal, or so they thought. We were sitting in the living room, and my mom had that carefully rehearsed tone, the one she used when she wanted something but didn't want to seem too demanding. If you agree to let Jake move in, she began, we'll only ask you to pay half the rent. That's fair, isn't it? I stared at her, genuinely stunned. Half the rent for a house I'm not even living in? I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. How is that fair? It's temporary, my dad chimed in, clearly trying to back her up, just until Jake gets back on his feet. And we're not asking you to leave right away. You can stay here for a few more months while you look for another place. Dad, I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. Do you hear yourselves? You're asking me to move out, keep paying for the house, and essentially fund Jake's lifestyle. What part of that sounds fair to you? It's not about fairness, my mom said, her voice trembling with emotion. It's about family. Jake needs our help right now, and we thought you'd understand that. There it was again, the guilt trip disguised as a plea for unity. It didn't matter that I'd been paying rent reliably for years, that I'd turned this house into my home, or that I was being asked to make yet another sacrifice for Jake. All that mattered was that Jake was in trouble, and I was the solution. I leaned back on the couch, crossing my arms. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. You want me to keep paying for a house that I'm not living in, just so Jake can move in? And this is your idea of a compromise. It's just temporary, my mom repeated, her voice soft but insistent. You know, Jake's been through so much. He just needs a little time to get back on track. And what happens when Jake's temporary situation becomes permanent? I asked. Because let's be honest, we've all seen this movie before. Jake gets what he wants, and I'm expected to deal with the fallout. My dad sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Why do you have to make everything so difficult? We're just trying to support Jake during a tough time. Is that so much to ask? Yes, it is, I said bluntly. Because you're not asking for my help. You're asking me to completely uproot my life so Jake doesn't have to deal with the consequences of his own decisions. That's not fair, and it's not okay. The room fell silent for a moment, and I could see the frustration building on their faces. My mom finally broke the silence, her voice shaking. You're so selfish, she said. I don't know what happened to the kind, caring person you used to be. This isn't the child we raised. Hearing her say that stung, but I refused to let it show. No, Mom, I said quietly but firmly. What you raised me to be was a doormat for Jake. And I'm done playing that role. My dad shook his head, clearly at a loss. This isn't about favoritism, he said. It's about doing what's best for the family. No, I said, standing up. It's about doing what's best for Jake, as always. And I'm not going to sacrifice my home and my peace of mind to make his life easier. After that, I left, feeling both angry and strangely empowered. For once, I hadn't let their guilt trips get to me. I hadn't caved to their demands or let them manipulate me into putting Jake's needs ahead of my own. But I also knew this wasn't the end of it. Sure enough, the calls started coming the next day. My mom left a voicemail, her tone dripping with disappointment. We're trying to work with you, but you're making it so hard. Don't you see how much this means to us? Then Jake chimed in, sending me a text that was equal parts entitled and passive-aggressive. Thanks for making everything harder than it needs to be. I thought we were supposed to be family. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were the ones making everything harder by refusing to take no for an answer. But I wasn't going to back down. If they thought they could guilt me into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Over the next few days, I started thinking about what this whole situation really meant. It wasn't just about the house. It was about years of being overlooked, undervalued, and pushed aside for Jake. And now that I was finally standing up for myself, they didn't know how to handle it. But I wasn't going to let their disappointment sway me. I had worked too hard to build my life, to find stability and independence. I wasn't going to throw that away just because Jake couldn't manage his own responsibilities. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that my parents were plotting something. They weren't the type to let things go, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they came back with another scheme. But whatever it was, I was ready. This time, I was standing my ground. After walking away from my parents' latest guilt-laden attempt to push me out of my own home, I knew it was time to take control of the situation. It was clear they weren't going to back down, and neither was I. If they thought they could pressure me into leaving on their terms, they were in for a rude awakening. The first thing I did was dig out my lease agreement. I kept every document from the day I moved in, along with receipts for every rent payment I'd made. If my parents wanted to play hardball, I'd be ready. As I flipped through the pages of the lease, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. The terms were clear. As long as I continued paying rent, they couldn't just kick me out on a whim. Still, I needed to be sure. So, I made an appointment with a lawyer. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Karen, ironic, I know, listened carefully as I explained the situation. She took notes, flipping through the lease agreement I'd handed her, and nodded thoughtfully. First of all, she said, your parents cannot force you to move out without proper notice. Even if they own the house, the lease agreement protects your rights as a tenant. As long as you're paying rent and not violating any terms, they don't have a leg to stand on. That was exactly what I needed to hear. And what about this nonsense about me continuing to pay rent if I move out? I asked. Karen raised an eyebrow. That's not enforceable. They can't require you to pay rent on a property you're no longer living in unless you voluntarily agree to it, which I strongly advise you not to. If they try to push that angle, they're going to lose. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time, I realized I wasn't as helpless as my parents wanted me to believe. I had legal rights, and I wasn't afraid to use them. But Karen didn't stop there. If they try to evict you without cause, she said, they'd have to go through the proper legal channels, which would take time and cost them money. And even then, they'd have to prove they gave you sufficient notice and followed the law to the letter. From what you've told me, it doesn't sound like they're prepared to do that. Her words gave me a renewed sense of power. For so long, I'd felt like I was at the mercy of my parents' whims, but now I realized I had options. So, what do you recommend I do next? I asked. Karen smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Keep paying rent on time, keep the house in good condition, and document everything. If they send you any letters, emails, or texts about moving out or changing the rent terms, save them. And if they try to take any action, call me immediately. We'll make sure they can't push you around. I left her office feeling more confident than I had in weeks. My parents might have been used to getting their way, but this time, things were going to be different. That night, I started putting my plan into motion. First, I drafted an email to my parents, outlining my position in clear, respectful terms. Dear Mom and Dad, I wrote, I've taken some time to think about your recent request for me to move out of the house, and I want to be transparent about where I stand. I've reviewed my lease agreement, and as long as I continue paying rent on time, I have the right to remain in the property. I'm not willing to leave or pay rent for a house I'm not living in. I understand that you're trying to help Jake, and I hope you can find a solution that works for him. However, I need to prioritize my own stability and well-being. I hope you can respect my decision. I hit send, knowing full well it would trigger another round of arguments, but I didn't care. For the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my life. Predictably, the response was immediate. My mom called me within minutes of reading the email, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. I can't believe you'd send something so cold, she said. We're your parents. We're just trying to do what's best for the family. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. Mom, I said, this isn't about being cold. It's about being clear. I've spent my whole life putting Jake's needs ahead of mine, and I'm not doing it anymore. I love you, but I have to draw the line somewhere. My dad chimed in from the background, his voice sharp. You're being stubborn for no reason. Do you really want to turn this into a legal battle? If it comes to that, I said firmly, then yes. I'm prepared to defend my rights. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, my mom said, we'll talk about this later, and hung up. The days that followed were tense, but I stuck to my plan. I paid my rent on time, documented every interaction with my parents, and started looking for any potential red flags that might indicate they were planning something. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just the house. It was about years of being overlooked, undervalued, and taken for granted. And now that I was finally standing up for myself, my parents didn't know how to handle it. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I had a plan, I had legal support, and I wasn't backing down. If my parents wanted to push me out of my home, they were going to have to fight for it. And they were going to lose. When I didn't budge after my email, my parents' calm facade began to crumble. They clearly expected me to give in, as I always had in the past. But this time was different, and it didn't take long for their desperation to start showing. My mom was the first to ramp things up. She called me constantly, leaving voicemails dripping with guilt and passive aggressiveness. I just don't understand how you can be so selfish, she said in one message. Jake is struggling, and you're turning your back on him. Don't you care about your family anymore? Another time, she tried a more aggressive approach. If you don't help Jake, you'll regret it, she said one night. Family is supposed to stick together. You're acting like a stranger, and it's breaking my heart. I wanted to yell, to point out how one-sided this supposed family support had always been, but I forced myself to stay calm. I let her words wash over me, taking solace in the fact that, for once, I wasn't letting her manipulate me. My dad, on the other hand, took a different approach. While my mom leaned into guilt and emotion, he tried to appeal to my sense of duty. We've done so much for you, he said during one particularly tense phone call. This is the least you could do for us. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at that. What exactly have you done for me, Dad? I asked. Because from where I'm standing, most of the sacrifices in this family have been mine. I gave up the bigger bedroom, so Jake could have it. I gave up my car when he wrecked his. I've spent my whole life stepping aside, so Jake could have everything handed to him. That's not fair, he said sharply. We've always treated you both equally. Really? I shot back. Then why is it always me who has to compromise? Why is it always my life that gets disrupted so Jake can have his way? He didn't have an answer for that, but I could hear the frustration in his voice when he said, "This isn't about the past. It's about what we need to do now. Jake needs a place to live, and we thought you'd understand that. If you want Jake to have a place to live, that's on you," I said firmly. "But don't expect me to sacrifice my home for him." Their desperation reached a new level when they started trying to involve other family members. My mom called my aunt or sister and convinced her to call me and talk some sense into me. "It's not that big of a deal," my aunt said when we spoke. "You're young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. What's a little inconvenience for the sake of family?" "It's not a little inconvenience," I replied, my voice sharp. "They're asking me to give up my home, keep paying rent, and make room for Jake, who's perfectly capable of finding a solution on his own. How is that fair?" My aunt hesitated, clearly trying to come up with a counterargument. "Well, life isn't always fair," she said finally. "Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do for the people we love. And I've done that my whole life," I said. "But this is where I draw the line." She sighed, clearly exasperated. "You know, your mom and dad just want what's best for everyone. Maybe you could try being a little more understanding." "I've been understanding for years," I said. "It's their turn now." Meanwhile, Jake was doing his part to escalate the situation. He started posting passive-aggressive comments on social media, clearly aimed at me. One post read, "It's sad when family turns their back on you. You think you can count on people, but I guess not everyone sees the value in family anymore." I resisted the urge to respond, even though every post felt like a personal attack. The last thing I wanted was to get into a public feud with my brother, especially when I knew he was doing it to rally sympathy from anyone who'd listen. But the final straw came when Jake decided to confront me directly. He showed up at my house one evening, uninvited, looking every bit the wounded victim. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice heavy with exaggerated sincerity. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let him in. Once inside, Jake wasted no time getting to the point. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this," he said, sinking into the couch like he owned the place. "Mom and Dad are just trying to help me out. Why can't you?" "Jake," I said, sitting across from him, "this isn't about not helping you. It's about the way they're going about it. They're asking me to give up my home and keep paying rent for you. That's not help. That's exploitation." He rolled his eyes. "You're being so dramatic. It's not like they're kicking you out tomorrow, and it's just temporary. I don't see why this has to be such a big deal." "It's a big deal because it's my life," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "You've always had Mom and Dad bending over backward to make things easier for you, but I'm done playing that game. If you need help, figure it out. I'm not going to solve your problems for you." Jake's face hardened. "You know, for someone who talks so much about family, you sure don't act like it." "Family works both ways, Jake," I said. "And right now, it feels like I'm the only one who's expected to give. If that's what family means to you, then maybe you need to rethink your definition." Jake left after that, slamming the door behind him. I felt a mixture of anger and relief. It was exhausting standing up to my family, but I knew it was the right thing to do. As the days went on, my parents' desperation only grew, but I stayed firm. Every guilt trip, every veiled threat, only strengthened my resolve. They could pressure me all they wanted, but I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into sacrificing my home for Jake's convenience. For the first time in my life, I was standing my ground, and I wasn't backing down. After weeks of holding my ground and fending off my parents' increasingly desperate tactics, I thought I had a clear picture of the situation. The house was theirs, and while I had a lease agreement protecting my right to live there, I'd resigned myself to the fact that ownership was out of the question. At least, that's what I thought, until my lawyer uncovered something that changed everything. It started during a follow-up meeting with Karen, my lawyer. We were going over the details of my lease agreement again, just to make sure I was fully protected against any potential eviction attempts. She was flipping through the paperwork when she paused, her brow furrowing. "Wait a minute," she said, tapping the edge of a page. "This clause here about ownership. When exactly did your parents acquire this property?" I frowned, caught off guard by the question. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I think they've owned it since I was a kid. It used to belong to my grandparents." Karen's eyes lit up with interest. "Your grandparents? Do you know if the property was ever officially left to them in a will, or if there was some kind of transfer?" The question made me pause. I hadn't thought about it in years, but I did remember my grandparents talking about how they wanted to leave the house to me. At the time, it had seemed like a distant, abstract idea, something for the far-off future. But now, with Karen's question hanging in the air, It felt like it might be more than just a childhood memory. I'm not sure, I said slowly. But I think my grandparents might have wanted the house to go to me originally. Karen leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. If that's the case, it could change everything. Let me do some digging and see if I can find out more about the property's history. Over the next few days, Karen worked her magic. She pulled property records, wills, and deeds, piecing together a timeline of ownership for the house. When she called me back in her office, I could tell by the look on her face that she'd found something big. You were right, she said, sliding a stack of documents across the desk. Your grandparents did intend for the house to go to you. It was explicitly stated in their will. But when you were a minor, your parents petitioned to take control of the property on your behalf. They argued that it would be better for them to manage it until you were of age. I stared at the papers, my heart pounding. So, what does that mean? It means, Karen said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, that technically, the house was never truly theirs to begin with. They've been holding it in trust for you all these years. And if we can prove that they violated the terms of that trust, you might have a legitimate claim to regain ownership. Her words hit me like a thunderclap. For weeks, I'd been fighting to keep my place in the house, feeling like I was at the mercy of my parents' whims. But now, there was a chance, however slim, that the house wasn't even theirs to control. Is this something we can actually pursue? I asked, still trying to wrap my head around the revelation. Karen nodded. It won't be easy, and it'll take time. But the documentation is solid. Your grandparents will is clear about their intentions, and we have records showing how your parents took control when you were a minor. If you're willing to fight for it, I think you have a strong case. I sat back in my chair, stunned. The idea that the house might legally belong to me was almost too good to be true. But the more I thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. My parents had always treated the house as their property, but they'd also been oddly insistent on keeping me tied to it. Was it guilt? Or had they been worried all along that I might eventually uncover the truth? That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Karen had said. I pulled out old family photos, searching for any clues I might have overlooked. One picture, in particular, caught my attention, a photo of me as a child standing in front of the house with my grandparents. Written on the back of the photo, in my grandmother's neat handwriting, were the words, "Our little legacy, for our little one." Tears stung my eyes as I stared at the photo. My grandparents had always been kind, supportive, and fiercely protective of me. If they'd intended for the house to be mine, I owed it to them, and to myself, to fight for it. The next day, I called Karen and told her I was ready to move forward. Let's do it, I said. Let's fight for the house. When my parents found out what I was planning, their reaction was explosive. My mom called me in tears, accusing me of betrayal. How could you do this to us? She sobbed. After everything we've done for you? My dad was equally furious, though his anger was more restrained. This is ridiculous, he said. We've managed that house for years. You think you can just swoop in and take it from us? It was never yours to take in the first place, I said calmly. You've been holding it in trust for me, and now I'm claiming what's rightfully mine. Their outrage was palpable, but for the first time, I didn't feel intimidated. I had the truth on my side, and I wasn't backing down. The fight was just beginning, but I was ready for it. And no matter how messy things got, I knew one thing for certain. My grandparents had wanted this house to be my legacy, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. The moment I decided to move forward with a claim to regain ownership of the house, I knew things were about to get ugly. My parents had already shown they were willing to manipulate and guilt-trip me to get their way. But now that I was actively challenging their control over the property, they were about to take things to a whole new level. Karen wasted no time filing the necessary paperwork. She laid out the case clearly, citing the terms of my grandparents' will and the evidence showing how my parents had assumed ownership under the guise of managing the property for me as a minor. The law is on your side, she assured me. But be prepared. This is going to get personal. She wasn't kidding. When my parents were served with the legal notice, I got an angry phone call from my mom almost immediately. You're suing us now? She screamed, her voice trembling with rage. How could you do this to your own family? I stayed calm, refusing to rise to her bait. You forced my hand, I said. I gave you every opportunity to respect my boundaries, and you ignored them. Now, I'm just taking back what's rightfully mine. Rightfully yours? She spat. We've been taking care of that house for years. Do you have any idea how much money we've spent on maintenance, taxes, and everything else? And this is how you repay us? Mom, I said, my voice steady, the house was never yours to begin with. It was left to me by Grandma and Grandpa, and you've been holding it in trust. You don't get to rewrite history just because it's inconvenient for you now. She hung up on me, but I knew this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the legal battle escalated quickly. My parents hired their own lawyer, a smug man who clearly thought he could intimidate me into backing down. He sent Karen a barrage of counterclaims, arguing that my parents had every right to the house because they'd maintained and improved it over the years. Karen wasn't fazed. That's a weak argument, she said, flipping through the documents. Their job as trustees was to manage the property responsibly until you were old enough to take ownership. They can't claim ownership just because they fulfilled that basic duty. Still, the process was grueling. Every court filing dredged up old wounds, and my parents didn't hesitate to air their grievances in an attempt to paint me as ungrateful and entitled. She's always been difficult, my mom declared in one of the depositions. We've done nothing but support her, and now she's turning on us. They even dragged Jake into it, with him claiming that I was trying to tear the family apart. Can you believe this? I said to Karen after reading through one particularly nasty filing. They're making me sound like some kind of villain. Don't let it get to you, she said. This is all smoke and mirrors. The facts are on your side, and that's what the court cares about. As the months dragged on, the tension within the family reached a boiling point. My parents started reaching out to other relatives, trying to rally them against me. I got calls from cousins, aunts, and uncles, all saying the same thing. Why can't you just drop this? It's not worth destroying the family over a house. I tried to explain my side, but most of them had already been swayed by my parents' narrative. The few who did support me quietly admitted they didn't want to get involved for fear of upsetting the family dynamic. The stress was overwhelming at times, but I refused to back down. Every time I felt doubt creeping in, I thought about my grandparents, their wishes, their legacy, and the little note on the back of that photo. Our little legacy, for our little one. That was what kept me going. When the case finally went to court, it was a grueling process. Both sides presented their evidence, and my parents' lawyer tried to argue that they'd acted in good faith by taking control of the house. But the records didn't lie. Karen presented the will, the original deed, and financial records showing that my parents had used rental income from the house to cover expenses, proving that they hadn't actually been out of pocket as much as they claimed. She also highlighted the fact that they'd never officially transferred ownership to me when I became an adult, despite the clear terms of the trust. The turning point came when the judge asked my parents a pointed question. Why, after all these years, did you never inform your daughter of her legal claim to the properties? My mom stammered something about not wanting to burden me with the responsibility, but it was clear the judge wasn't buying it. After weeks of arguments and evidence, the court finally ruled in my favor. The judge's decision was clear. The house had always been intended for me, and my parents had failed in their duty as trustees to transfer ownership when the time came. When Karen called to give me the news, I could hardly believe it. You did it, she said. The house is yours. I felt a rush of emotions, relief, vindication, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude to my grandparents. They'd fought to ensure I had a secure future, and now, despite everything, their wishes were finally being honored. My parents, predictably, didn't take the loss well. My mom called me in tears, accusing me of destroying the family. Jake sent me a scathing text, calling me selfish and declaring that he'd never forgive me. But for the first time, their words didn't affect me. I'd spent my whole life putting their needs ahead of my own, and now I was finally free. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of my independence, my resilience, and my refusal to be anyone's doormat ever again. The battle was over, and I'd won. The fallout from the court's decision was swift and brutal. My parents wasted no time cutting me off entirely, but not before making it abundantly clear how they felt about me. My mom called one last time, her voice trembling with fury and something that might have been genuine heartbreak. You've destroyed this family, she said, her words sharp as knives. Do you have any idea what you've done? Your father and I gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? You're nothing but selfish. I wanted to argue, to remind her of all the sacrifices I'd made over the years, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. She wasn't interested in the truth, only in framing herself as the victim. So I said the only thing that felt right in the moment. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mom, but I'm not sorry for standing up for myself. She hung up on me, and just like that, our relationship was severed. Jake, predictably, took their side. He texted me a string of messages that ranged from angry to self-pitying. I can't believe you did this. After everything Mom and Dad have done for you, you stab them in the back? You've always been selfish. I don't know why I ever expected better from you. Don't bother calling me. You're dead to me." The words stung, but they didn't surprise me. Jake had always seen himself as the center of the family, the one who deserved the most attention and resources. Now that the house was out of reach, he needed someone to blame, and I was the obvious target. For a moment, I wondered if I should respond, if I should try to explain my side of the story. But then I thought about all the times I tried to reason with Jake in the past, and how it had always ended the same way, with him refusing to see anything beyond his own perspective. So, I left his messages unanswered and blocked his number. The extended family wasn't much better. Word spread quickly about the court case, and my parents wasted no time painting me as the villain. At family gatherings, I became a topic of whispered conversations and judgmental stares. My aunt, one of my mom's closest confidants, called me out of the blue to express her disappointment. "I just don't understand why you couldn't work this out privately," she said. "Taking your own parents to court? That's a step too far, don't you think?" I bit back my frustration and replied as calmly as I could. They had every chance to work this out privately. They're the ones who refused to listen. All I did was stand up for what was right. "Well," she said with a heavy sigh, "I hope you're happy, because this family may never recover from this." It was the kind of comment that would have crushed me a year ago, but now it barely registered. I was done carrying the weight of other people's expectations. Despite all the negativity, there were a few bright spots. My dad's side of the family, who had always been closer to my grandparents, reached out to offer quiet support. My aunt on his side sent me a heartfelt message. "I know this has been hard, but you did the right thing. Your grandparents would be so proud of you for standing up for yourself." Hearing that was like a balm for my soul. For so long, I'd felt isolated and vilified, but knowing that someone understood what I'd been through made all the difference. I also started hearing from friends who had watched the situation unfold from the sidelines. Some of them had experienced similar family dynamics and saw my story as a validation of their own struggles. One friend texted me, "You're so brave for doing what you did. I wish I had the courage to stand up to my family the way you did." Those messages reminded me why I'd fought so hard. It wasn't just about the house. It was about breaking free from a lifetime of being treated as less than. The days that followed were a whirlwind of mixed emotions. On one hand, I felt a deep sense of loss. My relationship with my parents and Jake had been strained for years, but now it felt irreparable. I knew I'd never look at them the same way again, and that realization was heartbreaking. On the other hand, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: freedom. For the first time, I wasn't living under the weight of their expectations or sacrificing my own happiness to keep the peace. The house was mine now, not just legally, but emotionally. It was a symbol of my independence, my resilience, and my refusal to let anyone take advantage of me again. I spent the first few weeks after the court ruling reclaiming the space as my own. I repainted the walls, added new furniture, and filled the shelves with books and photos that made me happy. With every change I made, the house felt less like a battleground and more like a sanctuary. Looking back, I knew the fallout had been inevitable. People don't like it when you upset the status quo, especially in families where certain dynamics have been in place for decades. But as painful as it was, I didn't regret my decision. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing up for myself and winning. And no matter what anyone else thought, that was something no one could ever take away from me. The day I officially became the owner of the house was surreal. After months of legal battles, emotional fallout, and countless sleepless nights, it was finally over. The house was mine, not because it was handed to me, but because I fought for it. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office as Karen slid the final paperwork across the desk for me to sign. "Congratulations," she said, a smile breaking her usual no-nonsense demeanor. "This wasn't an easy fight, but you did it." As I signed my name, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with pride. For so long, I doubted myself, wondered if I was making the right decision, if it was worth all the pain and conflict. But in that moment, I knew I'd done the right thing. When I returned to the house that evening, it felt different, lighter, freer, like a weight had been lifted. I walked from room to room, taking it all in: the walls, the floors, the familiar creaks and quirks of the space. They were no longer reminders of conflict or uncertainty. They were mine, and they felt like home in a way they never had before. I spent the next few weeks reclaiming the house, both physically and emotionally. I painted the walls in colors that made me happy: soft blues and warm earth tones that turned the space into a haven. I replaced old, worn-out furniture with pieces I'd picked out myself, each one chosen with care and intention. The garden, which had been neglected during the chaos, became my personal project. I spent weekends planting flowers and shrubs, transforming it into a vibrant, living reflection of my new life. Every time I stepped outside and saw the blooms, I felt a sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just a house anymore, it was my sanctuary. My parents and Jake, predictably, stayed out of the picture. My mom hadn't contacted me since her final, furious phone call, and Jake's social media posts had dwindled into vague, passive-aggressive complaints about people who don't value family. At first, the silence felt strange. For years, I'd been so enmeshed in their demands and expectations that their absence left a noticeable void. But as time went on, I realized how much better my life was without their constant judgment and manipulation. I started focusing on building a life on my own terms. I threw myself into my work, taking on new challenges and responsibilities that reignited my passion for what I did. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in months, catching up over coffee and dinners that didn't involve family drama. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream about the future. What did I want? Where did I see myself in 5, 10 years? Without my parents' voices in my head, I felt free to explore those questions without guilt or second-guessing. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I thought about my grandparents. They'd always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. This house was their gift, their way of ensuring I had something to call my own. And while the journey to claim it had been far from easy, I knew they'd be proud of me for fighting for it. I pulled out the photo I'd found during the legal battle, the one of me as a child, standing in front of the house with my grandparents. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, were the words, "Our little legacy, for our little one." Tears welled up as I read those words again. But this time, they were tears of gratitude. My grandparents had left me more than just a house. They'd left me a reminder of my own strength and resilience. Looking back, I'm proud of the choices I made. Standing up to my family wasn't easy. It meant breaking ties with people who had been a central part of my life, enduring criticism from others who didn't understand, and facing the painful reality that not everyone who claims to love you has your best interests at heart. But it was worth it. My dad used to say, "Do what's right, even when it's hard." Those words had guided me through every step of this journey, giving me the courage to stand my ground even when it felt like the whole world was against me. The house isn't just a place to live. It's a symbol of my independence, my strength, and my refusal to be anyone's doormat ever again. Now, as I look ahead, I'm excited for what the future holds. This house is my foundation, my starting point for a life built on my own terms. And while the road to get here was far from easy, I wouldn't change a thing. Because this victory, it's mine and no one can take it away from me.